Today I want to show you how to make a variation of the reversible mask with ties, but this one has an opening for a filter, and you can use paper towel or coffee filter, but some people want a little extra protection, so this gives them that. Making and moving, I want to share with you simple things that you can add to your everyday life that can bring more mindfulness and moving and enjoyment to your making. So today I want to share one of my favorite mindfulness techniques, and I want to give a shout out to Lenny Sturba, who first shared this with me. And it's an amazing trick that uses breathing but also adds another layer, and it can be adapted to whatever situation you're in. So basically what you do is you come up with words. You come up with a word that describes what you need right now and a word that describes what you don't need. So for example, if I'm going to be making something, I need to be focused. And a lot of times I'm distracted. So what I would do is inhale, and in my mind or out loud you can actually say the words. So I'm going to breathe in, focus, and I'm going to breathe out, distraction. Breathe in, focus. Breathe out, distraction. Breathe in, focus. Breathe out, distraction. And you can do that as many times as you need. 3 is a good number to start with. And you can customize the words. Sometimes I breathe in peace and I breathe out stress. Whatever you need. If you need strength, if you need calm, if you need joy, try it, because it's really easy to do and you can adjust it to whatever your situation is at the moment. Thank you. Hello, I want to share 3 moving tips for you for when you're seated and you're not ready to get up and take a break, but your body needs some movement. So when you're in your chair, think about if you cross your legs, crossing different ways. So one that I recommend is doing actually a figure 4 stretch, bringing your ankle to your knee and having your knee at a right angle, and you should feel some stretching in your leg. And you can even sit here and work in this position for a little while if it's comfortable, if it fits under your desk, or if you don't need to be under your desk. And then you can switch legs. And so just keep in mind that we're taught that it's important to sit still, but our bodies actually need to move. And so it's okay to think about sitting different ways, crossing your legs different ways, and just adding some different movement that way. Another stretch that I like when I'm seated is a twist. So you can sit nice and straight, lift up through the crown of your head, and you can inhale, twist to the right. You can even reach your arm behind your chair if that's comfortable. And you can hold that 10, 20, 30, however long feels good, seconds. And then you can come gently around to the other side and do the same thing. And a lot of times when you're sitting for a long time or working, your back can start to bother you. And so this is a good break if you're studying, if you're working at your seat. And then one last one, a lot of times when we're on the computer or on our devices, we tend to start doing this. And so I encourage you to think about going the opposite direction. So once again, sit up nice and straight, and you can roll your shoulders to the back. You can also bring them forward if you like, but we do that a lot, so you may not need that one as much as you do the back. And if there's a certain place that feels really good, you can hold it there, but just try to counteract some of that forward. And also, when you're working, think about trying to keep good posture. So when you need a break and you're not ready to get out of your seat, try these 3 moves, and I hope they help you feel better. We'll begin by taking the 2 backing pieces and fold them in half lengthwise. If your fabric happens to have a print or a design you want it to be showing right now. So we'll fold it in half and then press it, and then do the same exact thing to the other piece so that you end up with your 2 backs folded in half. To make your ties, you have a couple options. Of course, if you have bias tape, that's the easiest, but if you are out, you can just use your fabric strips that you cut. And one option is to come to the ironing board, press under about 1/4 of an inch on one short side. Then you can press this in half. Let me bring it over so you can see it. You can press this in half and then bring the edges into the middle and press it again. I don't know about you, but I don't really enjoy pressing that much. And so if I can avoid pressing, I'm going to. So I'm going to show you another way. The other way to do your ties is at the sewing machine. And you can begin by folding under that 1/4 of an inch and then just tucking your sides in. Of course, now that I'm making a video, it's not cooperating. But fold them into the middle and then fold them in half. And if you want, you can put a pin. So you could pin this all the way down if that works for you. And I'll show you in a minute that you can also do it without a pin once you get started. So when you have your tie ready, one little trick to keep your tie from getting caught up in the feed dogs is to use a scrap piece of fabric. This one's about 1.5 inches by 3 inches. It doesn't need to be exact, but just something little that you can put under and sew on to get started. I like to put my needle down and then sew forward till I get close to the edge. And then I can lift up the presser foot and tuck the tie next to that piece of scrap fabric, come forward, go back, and then I can just continue sewing close to that double folded edge until I get to the end. So it is possible that you can do this as you go and fold it and tuck it in. So you can play with it and find out what you're comfortable with. I'm going to sew all the way to the end. And once you get to the end, we're going to reverse again. And then now that tie is going to function as our scrap piece of fabric, and you can tuck your next tie under and keep going. It did get caught a little bit, but it'll be okay. So you can keep going until you have all 4 of your ties. So a trick that I wanted to show you when I was cutting these is to keep your folded ends together and keep your raw edges together, and then lay them out with the raw edges close to you, and that'll make it easier for the next step, which is to take your fabric and actually pin. Technically you could pin everything at once, but I like to take the extra step and pin the ties so that I can make sure they get where they need to be. I like them in the corners at a 45-degree angle because it makes the mask a little more comfortable to wear. I'm also overlapping just a little bit just for insurance to make sure I've got the ties where I want them. The other thing to be aware of is your placement of the stitching. I like my stitching to face in towards the middle. You could have it all going down, but I would just be consistent. Pick something and be consistent. So after I have my ties pinned, then I'm ready to bring over my other pieces, and I'm going to do raw edges to raw edges. This fold is going to end up in the middle. So I'm going to start at one corner, take that pin out and repin it with everything lined up. I also like to put a pin on the short edge to hold down this fold. Come over here to the other side and do the same thing. And putting this pin in the middle over here is going to make sure that we end up with the fold down on both sides. You can put another pin here on the long edge if you would like for insurance. And then you'll also notice I'm kind of pulling all these ties so they end up in the middle. And that's going to make it easier to turn it and keep them out of the way when I'm sewing.
And then I can come over here, move this pin, and you'll see that we've got an overlap. This is going to create the opening where people can insert their filter. And remember, you know, you can use a piece of paper towel, a coffee filter, whatever people have that they want to use for extra security, they can put inside and then take it out when they're ready to wash their mask. I'm back at the sewing machine, and it doesn't really matter where you start. I like to start in the middle of one of the long edges. Just double check that it's lined up if you didn't pin. And I also like to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or about the width of your presser foot, because then I don't have to trim. So I'm going to come forward, reverse. If you have a needle down function, I would recommend it because we're going to pivot in the corners. So I'm going to sew forward until I get close to my corner. And then I'm going to slow down, get my pin out of the way, and then make sure that my needle is down, lift my presser foot, and I'm going to pivot to make a nice sharp stitching in that corner. I'm going to come down this way, and you don't need to worry about reinforcing right here because as part of our final stitching, we're going to sew these sides really well so that they don't come undone. Same thing here, get close to the corner if you need to, take an extra stitch, and then turn and pivot. Move those ties if you need to. And of course, if you don't have a needle down on your machine, you can do this with your hand wheel. Just turn your hand wheel towards you. And just double check, sometimes these overlaps slide a little bit, so just make any adjustments you need to so that it is lined up. And then we'll just come back and sew all the way and go ahead and reverse. And then you can trim your threads. Next, grab your scissors, and I like to cut out the excess from the corners. So you're going to clip close to the corner, but not over your stitching. So make sure you don't cut your stitching, but we're going to get rid of some of that extra fabric and that overlap from the ties. And that's going to help it to turn more easily. And then you can just flip this right side out. And the nice thing is you can use these ties to kind of tug the corners out, and they don't come out like square, they come out at an angle, and that's perfect. Back at the ironing board, I like to start on the wrong side just because, or the back side, because there's so many pieces of fabric back here. And you can kind of tug things in place a little bit, try to pull out those seams so that they're on the edge before we press. And then let's go ahead and give that a good press. Get rid of any threads. And then you can flip it over and do the same thing again if you'd like on the other side. If you want this to look really professional, of course you could come back and iron these ties. But honestly, after they get washed, everything gets kind of wrinkly anyway, so I don't stress out about it, especially if I'm making a bunch. If you're just making one and you want to be perfect, I would definitely iron the ties, but otherwise, don't worry about it. Even with this extra opening, these masks come together pretty quickly. So I'm back at the sewing machine and I'm going to be sewing the long edges with just a regular stitch. I like to start at the tie so that I can reverse several times there to reinforce it. And then I like to pivot again, put my needle down. And now I'm going to sew pretty close to the edge, about a 1/16. I have a little tiny red mark on my presser foot that's about perfect. So close to the edge without going over the edge. Okay, reverse over that tie. And then don't even worry about cutting your thread yet. Come over to the other long edge and do the same thing. And sew down the other long edge. and do the tie. Okay, and we are ready to go pleat. I've trimmed all my threads and now I'm ready to make the pleats. And I actually, for this one, I like to start on the wrong side because we have this big overlap and that is going to be our main pleat. And I like to hide that fold in the pleat. So basically where it overlaps, I'm going to fold it, and it's pretty substantial. It's a pretty large pleat, but you do want to put the pin on the right side. This is going to help it look nicer when it's folded, and then of course it'll open up and it doesn't really matter. But double check that you do the same exact thing on the other side. So we're going to have a nice fold that's going to hide the overlap. And then this mask is a little different than the reversible one because then the other two pleats are going to be pretty small, more like 1/4 inch. So we want to go the same direction and just keep them tiny because you don't want to go all the way to the ties. So we're going to have one big pleat and then we're going to have a couple little pleats. It is a little bit harder to manage because the fabric is thicker because we have that extra layer. So just do your best and do another pleat on the other side. So you will end up with 3 pleats, but one of them will be huge and the other 2 will be small. And then you want to mirror the same thing on the other side. So make sure that you make another little pleat at the top and pin it, and a small one at the bottom. And then we're going to be ready to go back to the machine. If you have a stretch stitch, that stitch that looks like 3 lines on top of each other or a really thick line, that's the easiest way to do this. You can also just sew it with a regular straight stitch, but sew it twice. So I definitely recommend the stretch stitch because it'll save you a little bit of time. At the machine, I'm going to select my stretch stitch, and this time I like to sew in a little bit further. So instead of sewing at 1/16 that red mark, I'm going to sew at about 1/8 inch, and it's where my opening ends. That's about right. I like to start up at the tie, and I have my stretch stitch, so I don't need to worry about reversing, but of course if you're straight stitching, make sure you reverse. And you do want to make sure you catch your pleat before you take the pins out. So I'm going to come forward, make sure I'm holding my pleats and pinning them so that they don't escape. Sometimes they get a little rebellious, especially with these thick pleats. So all the way down. Okay. If you don't happen to have a stretch stitch, so it looks like it's really thick because it goes back and forth 3 times. If you don't happen to have one of those, you can do it with a normal stitch. So same thing, about 1/8 inch from the edge, but this time reverse. So forward. So all the way down. And then I would put your needle down, flip it, and sew back over. We just want to make sure that that is really reinforced so that those pleats don't come undone. I've trimmed all my threads and I have my finished mask. I do have a couple of runaways here. So you can see when it's folded, and then of course it opens up on the face. On the back side, we have our hidden pocket, but you can open this up and tuck an extra layer of protection in there, and then of course remove it if it's paper before you wash. And there is your finished mask with filter opening and ties. Thank you for joining me on Mindful Making and Moving.